I think it's probably something to do with my age and that formative time of your life when you're growing up. I was in my teens when the what I would consider to be the golden age of Vietnam War movies came out from really from the late 70s to the early 80s. Well, I was kind of late teens, early 20s, and I can remember going to see Apocalypse Now, yeah, at the cinema. I can remember going to see The Deer Hunter, and they made a big impression on me. And I was a young university student at the time. I wanted to be a journalist, and being a kind of callow youth, I was thinking, this is also exciting. I'm going to be a war correspondent one day when I grow up. I never did. I did become a journalist, but never became a war correspondent. But I had that kind of interest in the whole area. I read a lot of books about Vietnam because, in the late 70s, the war had only just finished a few years earlier. And so, that kind of interest, I think that's where it came from originally. And then, of course, I went on to have a career in journalism and then film and television. And during a lot of this time, I also developed an interest in military history. And then, since I've been in Bath, got involved with the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. I now run the military history group there. And at some point, when I kind of finished my TV career and stepped back from that, this kind of two things of the film and TV background, the military history coalesced. And I'd had this thing that was bugging me for years, which is that I knew there was an anomaly about movies and the Vietnam War. And it was the fact that during the Vietnam War, during the peak of the war, hardly any major movies were made about the Vietnam War, which sounds like so what, no big deal. Except that if you look at the history, Hollywood made during the Second World War, while the fighting was going on, Hollywood turned out 150 war movies. During the Korean War, which was only 3 years long in 1950 to 53, they managed to turn out 22 movies about that war. They even made 7 movies about the First World War while the fighting was going on, all silent films. Vietnam, while the fighting was going on, 1 film. And that was in 1968.
It was the war, of course, that America lost. Most end in victory. This one ended in defeat.
Yeah, and the point being that the films in the previous wars, Hollywood saw a lot of the creatives in Hollywood, particularly in the Second World War and the Korean War, they saw their job as to get behind the national effort. American boys were fighting and dying off in a foreign land, to save the world from tyranny. Whether you take that face value or not, that's what the perception was. And so the Hollywood creatives thought, well, their job is to do morale boosting films for the people at home and that show Americans as being the good guys, the enemy of the bad guys, while the fighting was going on. Now, bear in mind, Vietnam, while the fighting was going on, they didn't do that. And this is before they'd lost the war and were humiliated, which they were. And the interesting thing is, you could say, well, okay, it was an unpopular war. That's why they made no films about it. But, you fast forward to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, while the fighting was going on in those wars, quite a lot of movies were made. So there's just this one weird conflict where just the one film.
I was going to say only one film made during the war. Did it take something like 10 years after the Vietnam War came to an end before they started making movies about it?
Yeah, no, 10 years from that so the one film that came out was The Green Berets, and it was a John Wayne film. And basically it was a World War II film set in Vietnam, square-jawed American heroes taking on the evil tyranny of communism, as opposed to taking on the Imperial Japanese or the Nazi Germans. It was just, it was absolutely textbook, old-fashioned war film. 1968, they didn't make another film until 1978, or the first film came out. A whole 10 years later, the American involvement in the war had ended in 1973 when the last troops pulled out. The war itself ended in 1975 when the whole of Vietnam was united under communism. So it was even 3 years after that before the first film came out. And when the new films came out, I mean, this is why I refer to this as a golden age of war movies, because
How were they different?
completely different in tone, in style. All those films that came out from World War II, from the Korean War, they were gung-ho, jingoistic. We're the good guys, you're the bad guys. We'll have some adversity, but we'll come out on top. Even when we lose, we win. Those were the films. They're very simplistic. The trauma caused by that Vietnam defeat, humiliation, nearly 60,000 young Americans killed in that battle, let alone an estimated 2 million Vietnamese. That traumatized America, but not just because of the death. It also changed the way Americans saw themselves. Things like the My Lai massacre, where clean-cut American boys slaughtered a village of children, women, and old people. During the My Lai massacre, where 500 people were slaughtered, not a single fighting-age Vietnamese man was seen during the entire day, but they still killed everyone. Um, Once that seeped through to the American consciousness, it was bewildering, because the American public thought, well, we're the good guys. We don't do things like that. So finding how they handled all that was very, very difficult. And when the new crop of films started from the 1978, particularly with The Deer Hunter, which is an absolutely brilliant film, and Coming Home, which was an anti-war film led by Jane Fonda, they were completely different, because they were looking at the pain of war. They weren't about glory or guts or anything. They were about pain, pain physical, pain psychological, and pain to the soul of the nation as well. And that was the big change.
You went on record as saying America deals with its traumas through the medium of Hollywood. Are you saying that's only true of the Vietnam War, or are there other examples?
No, I think it's generally considered that, issues, major cultural issues in America. One of the ways that they emerge, if in Europe in the 19th century, they would emerge through great works of literature. And if you like, the quintessential art form of America, even though there are many great writers and artists and whatever, is the movie. It's what they brought to the world, is the movie industry. And therefore, pretty much all the currents of, for example, there were some great movies made about the social changes of the 1960s, which were very painful for people at the time, and not unconnected with the attitudes to the Vietnam War, but the whole hippie peace love movement, the flower power, the rejection, the films like All the President's Men, the America went in the space of about 10 years from being a society that trusted its government really highly to being one that became very distrustful of government, because of things like Nixon, Watergate, the Pentagon Papers, which were documents released showing that the public had been lied to about the Vietnam War. You also had the political assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. A sort of a sense of distrust in government and authority permeated the 1960s and 70s, and there are many great movies that looked at that. It's interestingly the first concept of the deep state, i.e., the fact that your elected government aren't necessarily running things. There's a government behind the government, emerged, I think, in 1965 with a book written by a couple of journalists in America. It was called The Invisible Government. So those concepts emerged, and they were all, eventually they seep out through Hollywood, and then other things in more recent times. I think issues of the breakdown of families structures, the changing nature of male-female relationships. There have been great movies that reflect all these things, and they're memorable. And because they're a mass medium, they break through in a way that, for example, a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel won't.
We jokingly were chatting before I started recording, and I wondered whether the current trauma of an American gung-ho president might also make the odd movie in years to come, if we're all still here.
If we're all still here, I suspect that there are quite a lot of scripts in development under consideration that are looking at this. And, some of them will be absolutely on the nose. Others will be allegorical looks. You can imagine, I've even been told there are some sort of sci-fi movies that are meant to be allegorical of Trump and the current American situation. So I think we should watch this space on that one.
So where will your book sit on the bookshelf?
I suspect it will end up sitting in military history, although I think it could quite as comfortably sit in the kind of film, TV culture world. And if the bookshops are listening, I think perhaps in both would be ideal.
Did you actually talk to veterans as part of your research for the book?
Oh, I talked to lots of veterans about this. I talked to lots of people involved in making the movies as well. I talked to some of the actors and directors. But the most interesting interviewees for my research in this book were the veterans themselves, because I wanted to get their take on the movies themselves, which was quite interesting. So they had, for example, they really, a lot of them liked movies like Apocalypse Now and The Deer Hunter, but they didn't feel they related to the real Vietnam experience at all. But there was one movie that came along that they pretty much universally said, when I went to see this, my jaw hit the floor, and I felt, after the first 5 minutes of the movie, I felt I was back in Vietnam. And that was a film called Platoon, 1986. And the interesting thing about Platoon is that it was directed by Oliver Stone, who was himself a decorated Vietnam veteran. And he was approached by a 3-tour veteran called Captain Dale Dye, who, after he left the military, had been going around Hollywood with this idea. Captain Dye was a proper soldier, and he hated the way soldiers were portrayed in movies. He thought they just didn't look real. So he had this idea that he could make actors into better soldiers by taking them through a really intensive boot camp before they filmed their films. And he was touting this idea around Hollywood for a year. He was about to give up because no one was interested. And he managed to sort of snaffle a 5-minute interview with Oliver Stone, a fellow veteran. And Oliver Stone saw some potential in it. So when they went to prepare for shooting Platoon, they took the entire cast, including, Johnny Depp, Charlie Sheen, Tom Berenger, Willem Dafoe, took them off to the Philippines jungle, just left them with Captain Dye and his crew of hard-bitten veterans. And they left them in the jungle and they brutalized them for weeks. And then at the end of it, they started filming. And the first day of filming was the morning after they finished this boot camp. But they were all, they'd all lost weight. They were all battered, bruised. And at 6:00 that morning, Oliver Stone said, "Right, on your feet, we're filming." And that opening scene, anyone who's seen the film, quite within about a minute of the opening, you see this platoon walking through the jungle, looking awful. And that's the scene that veterans said, they just sat down, they've got their popcorn, sitting down to enjoy a movie, and then they suddenly went, oh my God, it's real. And it looked real because the guys were traumatized, basically.
No acting was required.
No, exactly. I suppose it's a form of ultimate method acting, isn't it?
Does it stop with the Vietnam War, or do you have other books in your mind?
I do have other books in my mind. I'd like to do something. I like, because of my background with doing military history and with the film and TV background, I like the idea of using the lens of how movies or even TV have treated certain periods of military history. I like that, looking at that, and I've got 1 or 2 ideas in the pipelines, which I'm talking to the publishers about. So, an obvious one would be to look at the more recent Iraq and Afghan wars, the post 9/11 wars, and the movies made about them, which started off from a very different starting point to John Wayne and his Green Berets.
Joe, I'm looking forward to reading the book, but where is it on sale in this area?
In the bookshops in Bath, hopefully, but definitely on Amazon, and and all the online booksellers seem to have it. I haven't actually been into. I'm pretty sure Toppings have got it, but I haven't been into the other bookshops in town yet. But hopefully it's there, and if it's not, I shall nag them.